Hello, welcome. In today's video, I wanted to address the general lack of knowledge around substances that most sober people have, and explain why it can be that way. Starting with, most sober people know very little about substances. What they do know comes from the state channels and predetermined narratives. Basically, what that means is most of sober people's drug knowledge comes from what the government puts out and all of their anti-drug media. It comes from things like news, it comes from headlines, basically anything that you see where you see it and just passing by it, not something that you really research. So say you're scrolling on your phone and you see like local man overdoses on heroin, or like man found dead in his apartment, likely cause of death, drug overdose. And that's all they see, which shapes their view in such a way where they only see negative information about drugs. They only see the worst side of the coin, and they only get shown information that negatively reinforces their views on drugs. Sober people also tend to be older, because everyone I know my age, the vast majority of them do substances, but most older people are quite sober, and they also lived through a time where fear-mongering around substances was much more widespread than it is now, because now the younger generation is generally at least a little bit more educated, and they're also more anti-state and anti-government. They're not just going to believe whatever they get shown. But the older generation kind of did, and so a lot of those fear-mongering views are embedded into their minds, which prevents them from forming new opinions now and causes the opinions that they have now around drugs to be quite negative. Sober people also don't really do research or try to figure out drugs for themselves, which makes complete sense, because why would they do that? It's not something that they do, it's not something that they're interested in, it's something that they quite strongly dislike and are against, so why would they research it and explore how it can be beneficial or good? They would rather just stick with their belief of it being bad because it suits their narrative. They've got no reason to research it more. Here are a few commonly held opinions that people who dislike drugs hold. Starting with, everything drug-related is bad. Basically, this means going out clubbing and drinking and partying, any amount of drug use, be it recreational smoking, be it self-therapy with psychedelics, be it opioid use that's not prescribed by a doctor, be it stimulant use that's not prescribed by a doctor. Say you have Adderall that you're getting off the street and taking, that's going to be very negative in their eyes compared to somebody who's taking Adderall because they get it prescribed by a doctor for their ADHD. Bongs are bad, blunts are bad, rap culture is bad, any sort of risky activity is bad because they often also involve drugs. So all of that just gets lumped together and labeled as bad. Another opinion that they hold is that not being sober is bad. And while this does largely hold up for things like work or high responsibility activities, you certainly don't need to be sober all the time. If you're just at home relaxing, or you've got time to yourself that you don't need to do anything at, it doesn't matter if you're sober or not. There's no stakes, there's no responsibility. If you're not sober and you are enjoying that time more, then that doesn't really negatively affect anybody except you potentially, but that's up to the individual to decide. So the opinion of not being sober equals bad is just a very black and white way of thinking that doesn't really account for people's private lives. Another opinion that these people have is that an altered state of consciousness is bad. This can be for a variety of reasons. Generally, it's going to be said that you're going to be less responsive, less smart, less quick in your thinking than if you were sober. But nobody looks at the positives, again, on this side of being able to examine yourself on a deeper level, being more creative, being less irritable, and generally of higher mood. All of those things can be used in a good or bad way. It just comes down to the individual that's using them. However, most sober people only see the negative, so they see the people that are slow, unresponsive, that skip work, that let the drugs control their lives and destroy it, and that shapes their opinion. So they hold the opinion that altered state of consciousness is bad. Another opinion that sober people hold is that everything is addictive and you need to be careful of everything, because if you don't, you're just going to end up getting addicted to it, or even worse, you're going to snowball and fall down the slippery slope of substances and eventually just be a homeless heroin addict. While to some extent the everything addictive part is kind of true, there are still substances that you won't get addicted to and that don't really have addictive tendencies behind them. For example, mushrooms and acid are very not addictive substances. You don't get that urge, that voice in your brain that tells you, yo, we should drop a tab, yo, we should drop a tab, yo, we should drop a tab, yo, we should take some shrooms. You don't really get that with those, but you do get it with things like weed or cocaine or nicotine. Those are examples of addictive substances, obviously weed being less addictive than the other two, but still, not everything that is a drug is going to get you completely hooked on it like they think heroin does, where if you take one hit of it, you're now permanently addicted to it for the rest of your life, and you can't do anything about it, and it's going to control your life and your decision making. That's not even true. People get off heroin, people clean up their lives. It's possible to even get off things like heroin, so why would it not be possible to get off things like weed or other less harder drugs? Also, thinking that you will fall down the slope of drugs and become a drug zombie, a heroin addict on the street, a meth junkie, anything like that. It's not a concrete, determined path that you go down as soon as you take your first rip of weed. That doesn't work like it. You have to obviously try heroin, and then you have to let yourself get addicted to them. It's not like you smoke a ball of weed and you're like, I wish I could shoot up some heroin right now. Like, no, that's not how it works. So most drug users who are going to be more educated than sober people are going to know how addictive heroin is, are going to know how life-ruining meth is, and they're not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole because they know it's bad and they know it will ruin their lives. They can be completely fine doing something like weed or psychedelics, but that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to go for the meth or for the heroin because it hits harder and they need that stronger high. That's just not how most people think, and sober people holding that opinion is kind of dehumanizing almost of substance users because they think they're just dopamine addicts who chase the highest high, trying to escape the most they can. When in reality, that's not the reason that most people use, and it doesn't get that bad, except for the very exceptional case. But there's always exceptions, so what can you do? Sober people also don't really have any knowledge of drug categories. To them, it's all just under a big umbrella term, drugs, and that's it. That's part of the reason why they think that every drug user is just going to end up a heroin addict, is because they have no distinction between what heroin is and what weed is, for example. They just think, oh, they're both drugs, but heroin is a stronger drug, so obviously you're going to end up doing heroin when the weed stops working for you. When people do different types of substances for different reasons. Weed is a very relaxational and very relaxing, very recreational type of substance, whereas somebody taking heroin, I wouldn't even go to start describing their mindset for that, because I've never been in that situation. And honestly, out of the very few people I know that have done heroin, I could not determine a reason as for why. So I can't really go into that. But even then, heroin is a completely different class of substance. It's an opioid, and somebody that does, for example, weed and MDMA, it's going to be, and that's their favorite stuff, okay, that's their favorite drugs, are going to be very unlikely to then suddenly go, oh, I actually like codeine and morphine now instead of my MDMA. And you're going to look at them and you're going to be like, what? That's a complete switch up. How do you go from uppers and stimulants to opioids and downers? It's a complete reverse of how they were thinking. Or somebody that does psychedelics is never going to go and suddenly start doing opioids again, because people do psychedelics to experience life on a deeper level. People do psychedelics to live in the truest sense of that word, when opioids numb you to the outside world and they numb your responses and your thoughts. So it just doesn't make any sense to jump across drug categories like that just because one is stronger. There's still different experiences there. There's still different things that people like. It's not all just one drug with a scale of how strong it is. There are different things that do different things, and people prefer them over certain other things because they like the effect and they like how it makes them feel. It's not all just one thing. Just to name some drug categories here for people that want concrete words that they can then say, there are hallucinogens, there are dissociatives, there are opioids, there are downers, there are uppers, there are stimulants, Moving on to most of sober people's knowledge coming from sensationalized headlines. News and the big media shape a lot of people's view on drugs because that is the most widely and easily accessible source of information for most people that have no interest in a topic. It's something that you'll just see in passing, be it on your phone in a news headline, be it on YouTube, be it on a billboard or a newspaper. You're just going to see the headline and move on. So a lot of people view drugs from the perspective of sensationalized claims and kind of attention-getting statements. And obviously, positive attention does not get nearly as much attention as negative things. So obviously the negative things get more publicity, and that's what people know about. Which is why things like, for example, crack addiction and the poor neighborhoods got so known about and spread, because people like hearing that negativity. They like hearing that bad thing that those other people are doing. And it's very easy to just put drugs as the enemy, drugs as the enemy. So people hate that and they have something in their mind to dislike. Don't read the headlines. Read more into what the actual substance was and how it was used. Research the substance. Obviously, if you don't like drugs, you're not going to do this. But just increasing education and knowledge around them is how we get people to understand more. And with an increased understanding, hatred and fear get reduced. And that is how we go to a more accepting and educated drug social sphere. Another thing that happens in news headlines is overdoses get just blamed on the drug and not on the surrounding conditions or mental factors of the person overdosing. Oftentimes, it's not the drug itself that kills you in an overdose. It's the fact that you pass out and vomit, and because you're so high, you don't realize that you vomited, so you breathe in your vomit and choke. Or you pass out and fall and hit your head. Or you tweak out so hard that you end up being dangerous and like police shoot you or something. It's very rare that that the substance itself causes organ failure or directly leads to your death. But it's very easy to just see, oh, a person died on drugs, so it's the drug's fault. That's so much easier to do, and there's no need to research or understand. You just point your finger at the substance and you go, this is bad, and this is why they died. So that's what happens, and that's why people think that drugs themselves cause overdoses and they're so dangerous. When in reality, most people doing them are educated on the risks and they hopefully know the dosage, so they're not going to overdose from the substance itself. Obviously, it can happen with stuff like opioids, like heroin, and you're just going to get so high that you don't care about breathing, and then you just suffocate and die. Like, that's an overdose from the substance because it directly made you stop breathing. But that's a very edge case once again. But that's what gets popularized, that's what gets spread in the media, and that's what people think of when they think drug overdose. So don't always blame the drug. It can be up to the situation and the person's own mental state. I touched on this earlier in the video, but most people who are not into substances only hear the bad, because that's what becomes popular. That's what's easy to digest and easy to understand. Nobody who doesn't do substances and lives a sober, normal life is going to suddenly go, oh, this psychedelic stuff is really interesting, let me just research it. Oh, this opioid stuff is really interesting, let me research it. I want to know how ketamine works, I want to know what it does to you and how it feels. Nobody's going to do that. They're just going to see drug bad and take it and run with it. They're going to see person overdoses and they're going to run with it. They're going to see addiction in lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods is on the rise and they're going to roll with it. That's all they see and that's all they care. They're just going to be like, oh, drugs are for poor bad people. I'm not one of them, so I don't do drugs and I don't care to learn about them. If spread more good about substances. That's one of the things I'm trying to do with this channel, is show people how they can be helpful in improving your life and not making it worse. They can help you and they can make things better. So if more people spread the message of substances having the ability to make things better, the opinion on them in the wider populace will hopefully change, and that would be so nice. Another thing that leads to the lack of knowledge around substances is people only seeing what they want to see and reinforcing their preconceived biases. People who don't like drugs won't learn about their benefits or safe practices. If they don't like them, they're just going to ignore them. Then guess what? If that person ever comes in contact with a substance and they're like, hey, let me do this, now all of a sudden they've come from a place of ignoring it and disliking it, not wanting to do it, and now when they're doing it, they have no idea of how to do it safely or efficiently or having the right mental state. They just go into it because learning about it causes them physical discomfort, so they just take it, and then boom, that person is much more likely to have a bad experience or an overdose because they have no clue what they're doing. Also, if they're reinforcing their preconceived negative biases, they're much more likely to think that drugs are dangerous and negative than they're positive and good. This is pretty obvious. I've mentioned this earlier in the video. People also only hear one side of the story. When an addict overdoses, it's the media that find their body and cover the story. When somebody has a bad trip, they post it online. When somebody's life gets ruined by substances, their family members talk about how substances ruined their life. You never see the other side of the story, how the person whose life got quote-unquote ruined by substances was suffering with severe mental health issues, and that those substances were the only way they could find to cope, or the addict being so hopeless in their life that they just did not care, and they might as well overdose or take so much that they'll either have the best time ever or overdose because they just don't care. They've got no reason to play it safe. But then that one negative story gets picked up, that one negative side gets picked up, and that's all that people hear, and that once again shapes their views to be negative. The media also, the wider populace also exaggerates overdoses and the risks of substances. Seeing a 5% overdose rate will make them freak out, despite that overdose rate potentially coming from misinformed people or hopeless people who just don't care, or people once again falling asleep on the substance and vomiting into their mouth, or people passing out and falling and hitting their head. That 5% OD rate doesn't necessarily mean that 5% of people taking the substance will just die. There are more factors to it, but they just see the 5% and get scared by it. Also, the 5% of drug users are much more likely to go harder and take more than your average person. So if you're an average person, that percent of overdose for you is way lower. It's just not 5. It's not. That's for people who are going crazy, for people who don't care, for the people that are taking way too much and they know it. That's the people who die. Or the lack of education. Spread education. Any possibility of danger is automatically a no. They see that it can lead to elevated heart rate, high blood pressure. They can see that it can make you try to uninstall yourself from reality. For example, on psychedelics, when you're having a crazy trip, it might feel like you're being spiritually guided to do so. They can see the risk of heart attack from doing stimulants, and all of that is instantly a no. But then those same people will go and drink, despite knowing the fact that that degenerates your liver and harms your brain as well. In some cases more than doing other substances. It's just a double standard and kind of a fake argument. Sober people also tend to ignore personal responsibility and safe practices. They don't consider the fact that some people want to do those substances and they're okay with the harm that they're potentially causing to their body. They are okay with taking the amount because they've done their research and they're doing it in a safe manner. They generally tend to know what they're doing. Alright, thank you. Those are some common misconceptions and gaps in people's knowledge that they tend to have around substances, especially if they're sober and have never done them before. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.